one of the subjects that came up on one of the operational reports was that the house of a guy called Raji Surani was attacked by Israel during the war. Raji Surani is an activist for the PFLP. The PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, is an internationally designated terrorist organization. It's one of the Gazan terrorist organizations that is actually holding hostages. This is an organization which is part of the PLO umbrella. It is an organization which receives funding from Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority. And so, Gerald, tell us a little bit more about Raji Surani, specifically the PFLP NGOs that are part of this whole anti-Israel and Israel demonization network.
There are, according to open source researchers, NGO-Monitors conducted for about 15 years, there's a network of at least 15 organizations that claim to do human rights, claim to do humanitarian aid, claim to do all sorts of other good deeds that are closely linked to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. As you said, they are part of the PLO. There are lots of interesting aspects of the PFLP. They are Oslo rejectionists. They attacked Arafat for having gone too far. Yeah. That's the kind of organization we think. They're a terrorist organization. We have this usual game that we hear from European diplomats where they say, well, there's a political wing and there's a military wing, and that's all nonsense. So this general framework, I believe, was probably created by a gentleman by the name of Shaman Jabarin, who sat in an Israeli jail for a number of months, maybe longer, because he was involved in recruiting and training PFLP terrorists. Just so we know, one more point before I get into the NGO aspect of this. The PFLP was the organization that conducted a terrorist attack back in August of 2019 that killed 17-year-old Rina Schneer. And
as you know, Gerald, I'm personally involved in that. I represent, amongst other things, the Schneer family, and I'm helping them navigate the case which is still ongoing against those terrorists.
And a number of the people who were involved, some of them arrested, some of them convicted, and some of them as part of the PFLP's own propaganda network, in which they take pride in this, that they were getting paid by and active in and had official stand, usually in financial positions or board positions, for these one or more of these 15 organizations. This is very important. And we're talking here about the NGOs because they are, it's called soft power in the language of political science. They are leading, very active in the campaign that presents this horrendous genocidal attack as justified resistance to occupation, as Palestinian liberation. They are largely, and you listed 3 categories, but in fact, they all go together.
Yeah, without question.
Because they are, those 15 are almost all entirely funded by European governments under the category or false flag or banner of human rights, of international aid, of peace building, believe it or not, of democracy. And we're talking about on the order of tens of millions of euros or whatever, krona and other European currencies a year. So you mentioned Raji Surani. Surani founded an organization. There's Al-Haq, which operates out of the West Bank, I believe, I think in Ramallah, I'm not sure. And then there's the PCHR, the Palestinian Center for Human Rights. They're basically mirror images of each other that's based in Gaza. And that's Surani's organization. These are propaganda organizations. They're not just propaganda organizations, but they make declarations that support Palestinian resistance. They run
just to open brackets, resistance, when they're talking about supporting Palestinian resistance, it means murdering people, carrying out terrorist attacks and terrorism.
It's a justification of terrorism. So, for instance, Surani's organization, PCHR, just let me get the exact text for the record here, issued a statement, I believe, October 8th, perhaps, in which they declared, it was October 8th, the Al-Haq That's the Sharon Jabreen organization, TCHR, Sarani's organization, Al-Mazan, which is another Gaza-based organization which claims to do human rights. They issued a statement calling for immediate action. This is October 8th, 24 hours or less after the genocidal attack that took place the day before, to stop Israel's reprisals against Palestinian civilians. Okay, Israel's revenge and reprisal against Gaza's civilian population and civilians. And they go on and on all of this. The crimes committed against the Palestinian people. This is all part of this propaganda campaign, the soft power campaign, which accompanies and has accompanied Palestinian terrorism continuously for 20 years. It has a number of effects, and I'm just giving you, we have dozens of quotes over the last 15, 16 days, that this network, this PFLP propaganda network, is pumping out in praise, support of, justification for Palestinian atrocities, the atrocities of Hamas. One after the other, they are, if you read newspaper descriptions of them, do they still use newspapers? News media descriptions. Highly respected organizations. So running the United Nations Special Rapporteur for something Palestinian territories,
Francesca Albanese, an unbelievable, unrepentant anti-Semite
from many years ago. And she talked about this great human rights advocate who justifies Palestinian terrorism. And so you see this, it's a machine. It's an industry or a sub-industry of these organizations involving, we've identified, NGO-Monitor's identified 75 individuals on the basis of publicly available open source information in this network that are affiliated with the PFLP in different ways, with very clear, this is not secret information, it's not information provided by Israeli security sources that only classified people who have classified clearance can see. This is any diplomat, any researcher, any academic, anybody in the world can look up. And you have to know what to look for. Sometimes you have to know Arabic, but you can see they're connected to the PFLP very clearly.
I just want to ask a question here. Sorry. Let's put aside the fact that these organizations are connected to the PFLP. What would the position of the European Union be, for example, if you were just talking about organizations that simply celebrated the massacre? Are these organizations, would they be funded by the Europeans?
First of all, let's say they have been funded by the Europeans. There are other organizations, but the PFLP framework is extremely important because it is the backbone of what I call the network of European NGOs, Palestinian and some Israeli NGO subcontractors. It's important to understand the very close relationship. When I speak, I don't know if you speak to European diplomats, when I speak to European diplomats on occasion, they don't usually like to do that. Sometimes they do, sometimes they can't help it.
They're embarrassed to hear the truth.
They're the same. Well, they have a set of standard slogans that they repeat, which they were fed by their capitals, by their governments, by their foreign ministries. They don't, maybe they know, I don't know what they know or don't know. A few of them have said to me privately that they know that these are lies. But whether they know or don't, they're diplomats. What's the line? The diplomat is someone who goes abroad to lie for their country. And this is not a personal attack, but in this particular case, we have case after case in which the European diplomats here and in their capitals and in testimony and speeches before parliaments will say, we have not seen evidence that demonstrates conclusively that these organizations are connected to the PFLP. So it's denial. And there's a huge cost, and this is where it's come. This is extremely important now. European governments are legitimizing, absorbing, helping to amplify and promote the messaging of genocidal mass murder under the framework of human rights and resistance. And you have this whole network, and you have Francesca Albanese from the United Nations and other United Nations officials all working on this together. So that's one major aspect of this whole campaign, which then gets quoted. Demonstrations on university, not just demonstrations, but harassment, attacks against Jews, attacks against synagogues, marches going through in Sydney and in Toronto that intimidate and are deliberately intended to intimidate and frighten Jewish communities, Jewish students. This is all part of that process. They're chanting the same slogans that these organizations put out, that Israel commits war crimes, that Israel is responsible for genocide. All this mirror imaging of what the Palestinians do to the Jews, they've adopted successfully. They sold it, and it starts with European funding. It's
inverting legitimacy.
Absolutely.
That's what it is.
Yes, it's a form. It's right. It's genocidal inversion, and it needs to be confronted, and it has to be confronted now.
Albanese, for example, as we know, constantly holds different sessions around the world with the heads of these different terrorist organizations. One of them is Adamir, that was headed by Khalida Jarrar. I was personally involved in her prosecution when she confessed to being a senior member in the PFLP, was sent to prison. And then now some of the senior staff of this organization, Adamir, which is a PFLP fund, were involved also in the murder of Rina Schnurr. And Albanese really on a constant basis is doing like a world tour with these heads of terrorist organizations.
Washington yesterday, and either participated or made it sound like she participated in this demonstration again in favor, supporting the Palestinian genocide of Israelis.
Yeah, and denying also Israel's right to respond and defend itself. That's echoing these claims of stop the bombardment, stop the immediate ceasefire.
The term genocide, a number of these organizations in their language. Again, this mirror imaging, this inversion. Now, you asked me about the broader picture.
The broader picture. Let's move on from then to the other ostensibly mainstream NGOs, Amnesty, Human Rights.
Before that, I just want to add that there's another level, I'll call it a second tier, that's not PFLP. Some of them are Hamas, some of them are PLO, like Hanan Ashrari's organization, Miftah, which is a little more careful sometimes, although in Arabic, because European diplomats who pay for this don't read the Arabic, talk about and put on there that Jews use blood of children to make a matzah.
Why would you read the Arabic? Of people speaking in Arabic?
Why would you
source for your information?
Why would you read anything when they are your friends and they tell you that they are human rights activists?
We're good guys, so you must believe us.
There's another layer, or another relatively new organization called Hamlet. Starts with they use 7. They don't have a chet to start with, so they use 7 Hamlets, and they get funded by the European governments and also by the Swiss. They also do poisonous propaganda, and they use the same type of language. So there's another layer which is not necessarily PFLP and terror linked directly, but they do the propaganda on behalf of it. And
so that's maybe what I was referring to before when I said, just if you have organizations that are not necessarily with terror links, but are part of that mechanism to spread that same propaganda that the massacre was a justified effort as part of the legitimate claims of the Palestinians for resistance. That group of people or of organizations, I understand, is also not small.
It's not at all small. And it's a significant, as I said, a second circle around the PFLP core, so to speak. So you have this organization, Hamlet, which I don't understand, and I'm doing this for 20 years, Maurice. For 20 years, I've never understood. I have understanding, but it's never in a formalized way, why Europeans have such a close embrace of these organizations. Rabbi Hamlet is an Israeli Arab organization, not a Palestinian organization. It has status within Israel as a nonprofit. Its funding comes from the EU, from Switzerland, Norway, Germany. And one of their board members posted on Facebook on the day of the massacre. They used the Hamas term, the Al-Aqsa flood operation by resistance fighters, infiltrating into numerous Israeli neighborhoods and settlements, firing rockets of resistance. This is from an organization funded by these governments. Okay, and then there's a third framework.
I have to stop you there for a second, John. Has NGO-Monitor or anyone else submitted a complaint to the Israeli police against this guy? I'll tell you why. On Wednesday and maybe tomorrow. Days have got a bit mixed up. Tomorrow, Tuesday. Tomorrow's Tuesday. So I apologize. So on Wednesday morning, there's actually a hearing in the Knesset regarding law enforcement for incitement. It's a subject that I know well. I led that change in Israeli policy in 2015 with the start of the knife intifada when I was head of the prosecution for Judea and Samaria. And so now I'm going back to that hearing on Wednesday. I think it's something that if it hasn't come up yet, it's something that can be specifically provided to the Israeli police. And at least there is talk of effective moves now being implemented in order to enforce the law against anyone who's incited. So if that hasn't yet been done, I suggest that complaint be put in as soon as possible, and whatever help I can give and we can give it, we'll be happy to do.
And let's go down to the third layer, which in some ways is far more dangerous and far more immoral. These are Palestinian groups that we've been talking about, and Palestinian groups are supporting the Palestinian cause. And the Palestinian cause is the removal of the state of Israel by any means necessary, including inhuman brutality. And then we have organizations which are global human rights reporters, global human rights supporters, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. And in many ways, they give far more legitimacy to the language that's used to demonize, to delegitimize not just Israel, but as you pointed out, any Israeli action to try to counter terrorist attacks. And they have, in my view, they're complicit in the terrible events of October 7th. Human Rights Watch, people like Kenneth Roth is no longer the head of Human Rights Watch. He retired last year after 30 years, but
is he still at Harvard pushing his same hatred?
He's pushing the same hatred. He was one of the first to post on Twitter when the Hamas did this. Israel attacked the hospital in Gaza and killed 500 innocent Palestinians, and the whole world went crazy. And the New York Times had it as a headline. Ken Roth was out there before almost anybody else.
And his little BDS sidekick, as you know, who NGO-Monitor was instrumental in having him expelled from Israel on his work and cancelled. Omer Shakir was there all the way. His posts remain on his Twitter feed.
And so does Ken Roth. I just checked Ken Roth.
It's just unbelievable. They spread that same lie, even though they know 100% that it's a lie, that Israel was not responsible for that attack.
Now, the New York Times, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, when I'm just going to use as examples because how closely all these things are connected. The New York Times correspondent in Israel received, like other journalists, an embargoed copy of Human Rights Watch's report discovering that Israel was an apartheid state. They said this is something new, a new stage. First of all, Human Rights Watch has been saying this since the Durban, the infamous anti-Semitic Durban conference, and we really can't talk about the power of NGOs without understanding that this became a fundamental part of the war against Israel back in September of 2001 or late August at the Durban UN conference against racism. Human Rights Watch was doing exactly the same type of propaganda, of really lethal propaganda. The New York Times, when they quote Ken Roth or Human Rights Watch, they talk about the highly respected. And when I spoke to the New York Times correspondent, because I knew he was going to write an article about this report that they had, this report, which is all complete. If anybody actually took the time to read it, it's all quoting their previous reports and Amnesty International reports and all sorts of other complete nonsense. It has anybody who understands what research is, anybody who cares, anybody who reads knows that it's total propaganda. The New York Times ran a big article. This was a 100-and-something page report, and they ran a big article about Human Rights Watch discovers that pronounces Israel as an apartheid state. If you, by the way, all of Human Rights Watch as an organization, as individuals, has done over 100 and something tweets since October 7th, in which the term apartheid is repeated over and over and over again. I just want to add a parenthetical comment.
And the number of times that they condemned the violence and the massacre.
I want to say that. That's an important point.
It's an important point because they use it as a fig leaf. Here, look, yes. We gave our token condemnation. We said it once, and that's enough.
So if Human Rights Watch says that Israel is guilty of apartheid, then Israel has no right to exist. If Human Rights Watch says Israel has no right to defend its citizens, and I did another interview with someone who was outside of Israel today, not familiar with what you and what many of our people who are listening probably know, and that is back in 2000 and was it 6 maybe or earlier? No, it was earlier. I think 2004. Human Rights Watch did a report called "Raising Rafah." Rafah is at the border between Gaza and Egypt, and in those days, the Palestinian Authority was still running. It was Arafat or Mahmoud Abbas or in that twilight period. Where they were digging tunnels and smuggling in explosives and weapons. And the IDF went in with bulldozers to try to destroy them. The entrances went through houses, just like what Hamas is doing now, but in a very small scale. Ken Roth flew to Israel, gave a press conference to launch that report. Of course, all the journalists immediately just quoted, just cut and paste and ate up all of his propaganda. Israel doesn't have the right to defend itself against being attacked by explosive and terrorist attacks coming from Gaza as a result of these tunnels that were being built, because that's a war crime. It was complete propaganda from A to Z. Ken Roth has been doing this for 30 years.
Terrorism, according to them, is legitimate, and Israel, as the victim, is not allowed to even defend itself against that onslaught. That's their worldview.
Let's remember that Human Rights Watch, in those days they had a smaller budget, but money went further. They have now a budget of $110 million. Ken Roth's greatest skill is in raising money.
Wow.
It's very interesting and something that I'm going to follow up on, and maybe somebody who's listening to this can help with that. Bill Ackman is one of the main people in Silicon Valley, high-tech billionaires. He gave Human Rights Watch $10 million in 2012. I haven't had a chance to check if he's still giving the money or not. Mr. Ackman has been livid over the support for Hamas in Harvard and university campuses. I don't remember the specifics of what he joined in condemning. But he's seen the damage that's done, and he can perhaps also denounce the people that he gave money to, just as the founder of Human Rights Watch, Bob Bernstein, did that in his New York Times article in 2009. And Bob, I knew very well, and had this difficult discussions with, and it was hard for him to acknowledge that the organization he founded, which had been, he handed over the keys to Ken Roth, had betrayed the very principles of human rights for which he founded. And continues to do that by bullying his way into Harvard as a fellow in human rights. Ken Roth, Human Rights Watch need to be called out for the immoral actions and people that they are. Not just for what they're doing now, but what they've been doing. Because when we see mobs on campuses and in streets of Sydney and in Toronto, harassing, intimidating, attacking Jews, supporters of Israel doesn't just have to be Jews, people who are Zionists. Ken Roth, if there's one individual who has responsibility for this kind of poison, and specifically for exploiting the principles of human rights, it's Mr. Roth, and he needs to be held accountable. That has to be his legacy, because that's what it is.
What's dangerous, Gerald, or even more dangerous about these organizations is the fact that they present many of their arguments as ostensible legal arguments. This is what international law says. This is a war crime. This is the definition of crimes against humanity. Putting everything, or trying to wrap everything up in that framework of legality and international humanitarian law, the laws of war. But really, what they're talking about, when also, as you said before, when you actually read what they're saying, it has no validity whatsoever. For example, when they say that every civilian death is a war crime, that's simply not true. That is not true. International law recognizes the fact that in war, civilians are sometimes hurt, injured, and killed even. And then
when you have in a terrorist entity like Gaza, where there's debates about that, let's say you have 1.5 million Palestinians. They are all human shields, which, as you know, I'm not an international lawyer or even any kind of a lawyer, but as you know, that's a fundamental war crime.
100%. Have they ever called out
absolutely
the terrorist group for
using the existence of human shields?
It's unbelievable. The fact that
they call Israel guilty of using human shields.
The fact that the terrorists hide their entire almost terror network and infrastructure in the civilian areas. The IDF put out today a number of infographics that you can find wandering around the internet as well, where they show the position of Hamas or terrorist rocket launchers in proximity to, on the wall of kindergartens, schools, UN facilities. They do this intentionally in order to use those facilities, not only the people and the kids that they're holding hostage as not also our hostages, but also the Palestinian hostages, using them as human shields intentionally. And this is all entirely ignored. But when damage is caused to a school, Human Rights Watch runs out and says, well, there's damage being caused to a school. Israel is clearly responsible for indiscriminately targeting the civilian population.
Again, it's important to see this as a network as it is. So you have Human Rights Watch, then you have Amnesty International, which has built into its system a number of blatant theological anti-Semites. Ken Roth uses his Jewish background. His father was a refugee from Hitler's Germany to disguise, hide, cover up his deep animosity was a stronger word, but I'm not sure what it is. It's far worse than animosity towards its hatred, towards Jews, towards Israel, towards Jewish establishment of Jewish self-sovereignty in our homeland, all of those things. It's a deeply held psychological aspect. But let's go beyond Kenneth Roth and Human Rights Watch. First of all, I will say it's not just Kenneth Roth, because he put in a number of acolytes. Sari Bashi is now appearing in all sorts of news networks. Sari Bashi, for 20 years, has been doing exactly what Ken Roth, the same lines, same slogans.
Sari Bashi also uses her Israeli connection
and her legal degree.
And her legal background, and the fact that she clerked in the Supreme Court as a means to give herself added credibility and give credibility to the claims, that really the baseless claims that she's making. When she claims apartheid, she doesn't explain how an Israeli Arabs are on the Supreme Court. They clerk in the Supreme Court. They work in the Supreme Court. They're judges, lawyers, doctors, army people. But Israel is an apartheid.
She, like Ken Roth, has a very deep, obviously psychological, because there's no rationality in, and very skilled at exploiting the ambiguity and the ignorance about what international law is all about. So she goes on one television program or video program or podcast or news network after another, spouting the same slogans and myths that Ken Roth does. The only way we're going to end this is for people who fund Human Rights Watch, who go to their dinners, get dressed up fancy and think that they are part of the great and the good of doing human rights, have to stop immediately. This is extremely important. If we can get those people to stop funding Human Rights Watch, we've taken a major part of this network.
How much, Gerald, do you think that we can create a world of October 6th on the one hand and October 7th and the aftermath on the other, explaining to the donors to these organizations, explaining to the European countries that what really they're funding, they're not funding human rights, they're not funding the promotion of peace. What they're funding is purely anti-Israel, which turns into genocidal acts by the terrorist organizations, do you think that we'll be able to make that change?
Look, I'm not going to try to look into crystal balls. I can be an optimist and say, I think this is a fundamental change.
Will this be a watershed event?
Or I can say these people have been doing this for 20 years. The Europeans have been hiding their eyes and not wanting to acknowledge, and it's hard. If you say that these are terrorist organizations, and I want to expand on this for a minute, then what you're saying is that for 20 years, I've been funding not just terror, but I've been funding the propaganda foundation for excuse for genocide and anti-Semitism, and the worst that we've seen since the Holocaust. And to say that means you've made tremendous mistakes. There's a big fight. And now let me start with the optimistic part. A number of European officials have said that we are freezing funding in review. And that's not the end of the story. But yesterday, for instance, the Danish government, the Austrian government have said that the Austrian government only provides minimal funding through the European Union. The Danish government is much more central in this. And last night, not only did the government say they're no longer funding, they're going to freeze funding. And that includes, because all these things are amplified by UNICEF and by UNRWA and all these UN organizations, and of course by Albanese and others. So the Danish government said we're going to freeze the funding, including looking at this funding for these soft power / human rights organizations. But one of the political parties, the Social Democratic Party, stopped immediately funding something they should never have done for a Gaza-based organization that was linked to the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine.
Also a terrorist organization.
Also a terrorist organization. And then again, it's themes and variations. They said they're going to stop funding immediately because of the praise that this organization had done for the genocidal attacks of October 7th. The project was for teaching democracy to Palestinians in Gaza through a terrorist-linked organization.
Again, it's just teaching democracy to the Palestinians in Gaza, where they haven't had elections for 16 years. They're run by a terrorist organization
but to
that they themselves elected.
To their credit, they at least did what the German Social Democrats has yet to do, which is to say this was a mistake, we're stopping immediately. Actually, they had already not renewed the funding. And that NGO-Monitor played a role. A good decision. Unlike many of their European counterparts who said, this is not evidence, we're not convinced, and I read the usual slogan. So that's what I'm saying, is that I think there is the beginnings of the change.
Just 1 second, if I just can remind the audience, for anyone, if you have questions, put them in the chat, and so we'll be able to address them just as we go along.
And if they're specific on NGO issues and we don't get a chance to answer, NGO-Monitor with a hyphen in the middle.org, you can find us and send me an email and we'll respond. I think there are other things that are going on in a broader sense. I mentioned Bill Ackman, and I believe that you will find there are others already. The Wexners, others have to stop funding to universities. I believe that they so strongly understand this issue that they will also cease funding to these NGOs. And if the funding for the Carr Center, which was the vehicle by which Ken Roth bullied his way into a fellowship by intimidating the dean who blew the whistle and said, this is not academically qualified, this is propaganda, I'm not going to sign off on the paper. If the Carr Center loses its funding and has to close, the world will be a safer place. And perhaps that's possible. The Europeans, the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, was here in Israel. And not the first time. She has, even before this terrible events, but she was here last week also, she has said that her heart and soul is with Israel. She's born in Germany, is a European and German politician. But she
differentiated from her foreign minister.
Exactly, that's what
Joseph Borrell,
Joseph Borrell is a Spanish socialist, what I call
who
said, no, we're going to add money to the Palestinians. We're going to, they needed humanitarian aid, 75 million. Okay, that means we can build more concrete terror tunnels, another 10,000 missiles to attack Israelis. This is someone who believes in human rights, Joseph Borrell. So, and he's the heir to Mogherini, who was previously held this position. who has similar positions, what's called the progressive left, which is part of the Palestinian support group, and that's where the money came from. Now, there's a huge debate going on within the European Union. The optimistic part of me says that there will be enough support for freezing this funding, for independent reviews to end. Anybody who does a serious independent review will never resume all this funding. I mean, it's clearly not just a farce, but it is the antithesis of the values that the European governments, democratic governments, claim to pursue. So I think that there is a basis if we are consistent, if members of parliament, journalists continue to hold the mirror up to these European politicians, the Palestinian lobby, and that's what it is, it's a Palestinian lobby. There are a lot of other incidents that give me some hope, cautiously, because I'm not usually that optimistic. I started off doing this NGO monitoring 20 years ago, being optimistic, and I realized it's massive cesspool. The industry that has no oversight, no regulation, no ethics. There are other examples. Irish high-tech person, very famous, very powerful, last name of Cosgrave, I believe Peter Cosgrave, had stated his support for the Palestinians and condemnation of Israel. I don't know the language he used, but it was exactly like the language that we used. Well, the pushback in Ireland, which is not sympathetic to Israel, was so great, and from the high-tech community, that he apologized, and he has gone off of Twitter or whatever it's called, X now, and probably will lose his position. I think that his apology and his silence was an attempt to salvage what little reputation he still has. There are other examples like that.
Frightening.
But it shows, oh, sorry, forget it.
He will lose his position because
you
can't be critical of the massacre?
He will lose his position because the recognition of the immorality of supporting what happened on October 7th, you asked about before and after October 7th, the immorality of what happened on October 7th was so blatant, so great. Look, Jewish history, we know that the world forgets very quickly. Donna Horn wrote a book about how the world loves dead Jews.
Yeah.
So one can be skeptical about that. But I believe that I want to believe with all caution that we will see this continuing, that at least the battle is engaged and they will not be able to easily just ram through more funding, more support, everything else like that. I see there's a question. Can I answer it right now?
Yeah, Lise Paulson, who is a regular participant in our...
Lise, if you go to NGO-Monitor.org, then you will see NGO-Monitor.org on the homepage. You will see 4 or 5 reports with very specific organizations and funders.
So let's just give Lisa's question so that we can be clear as to what Professor Steinberg responded to. Can you provide us with a list of organizations and funders in order of priority? There must be defunded and deplatformed. Really, that, as Gerald said, that list is on the website of NGO-Monitor. Go in, have a look, and look through there. The information is quite extensive, as opposed to our detractors. The research is thorough and very sourced.
So that if you don't, as I say to European diplomats, you don't have to believe me.
It's all there.
I'm an Israeli. I'm a Jew. I wear a kippah. Okay, do it yourself.
Yeah,
but that they won't do because they know that the information is in fact entirely
accessible. So I think on that note, Gerald, just a word to wrap up, if we may, and then so that we can have a takeaway. What would you ask people to do now, aside from Lisa's question or similar to Lisa's question? What would you say that what needs to be done? And maybe address the question that we got on the way from Maurice Carlin. Can you address NGOs like Jewish Voices for Peace, and the if not now, and the ostensibly Jewish organizations, Jewish NGOs that are active also in sit-ins in Congress and things like that. What would you say is the takeaway action movement for now?
I'll answer the second question first, and then close on the bigger picture. Jewish Voice for Peace and If Not Now began to be funded by the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation as a means of driving a wedge. That's the language they use between Israel and the Jewish people. That's obviously not a Jewish organization. The Rockefeller Brothers Foundation, gentleman by the name of Stephen Hines, that's his brainchild to drive the wedge between Israel and the Jewish people as a means of achieving peace. They, as some of my colleagues say, they are neither Jewish. Many of them are not Jewish, and they're certainly not for peace. We have on NGO-Monitor's website, we have 250 or so organizations. They're both listed there, and you can find out the available information on them. Many other questions are similarly addressed. I think the takeaway, the action item out of this is that, first of all, to understand the information, to understand that what this human rights and NGO world is really about. These are not well-meaning volunteers, misguided volunteers. This is a very powerful political framework in support of Hamas and support of the elimination of Israel and the Jewish people, right to independence and sovereignty. That's the language that has to be used. And when you see it quoted, whether it's the New York Times or the BBC or the local newspaper or campus or wherever else it is, or a speaker, and they have this aura we call the halo effect, you can look them up, confront them with the facts, naming and shaming. In each country, particularly the United States, through Congress, through different organizations, I think we have been generally successful in the sense that Congress has not allowed the administration to provide a great deal of funding for these organizations, unlike the Europeans. I think we can also go further than that, though. Members of Congress raise these issues with their European counterparts. Why do you allow your taxpayer funds to be used for these types of completely unacceptable, immoral propaganda operations? So the more we know and the more we raise it, I think the more that it has an impact. And the goal is, I'll put it very bluntly, to put these immoral organizations out of business and replace them with real human rights organizations. Unfortunately, the ones who actually do human rights and do not focus on demonizing Israel don't have the funds, don't have the visibility, don't get the clickbait of newspaper headlines of Human Rights Watch says, Amnesty International says Israel's a terrible country, it shouldn't exist. So we have to push back in all those ways. And I think this is what we have to do. That's our requirement. That's our contribution.
So I think that's probably the right idea. Also, you can, as well as going on to NGO-Monitor, you can also go onto the JCPA website, and you'll see there something that's being featured at the moment is the study done by Dan Diker, the president of the JCPA, on students for justice in Palestine being simply a front for Hamas, a forward movement for Hamas, the ostensible civilian face, but really they're not looking for justice in Palestine. What they're looking for is the eradication of the Jewish national homeland. They're looking for the destruction of Israel, supporting unequivocally and quite loudly almost every part of this immoral massacre committed by the Hamas and other terrorists. Thank you very much, friends. Thank you for joining us. We will be back again tomorrow at 4 o'clock Israel time. I made a mistake with the times before. I think it's 9 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, 6 o'clock in the morning if you're on the West Coast. And we will be joined tomorrow by, at the moment, by Itamar Marcus from Palestinian Media Watch. And we'll discuss a little bit more about the involvement of the Palestinian Authority, the so-called moderates in this whole effort, and also promulgating the propaganda of Hamas and adding their own fuel to the war against Israel. Gerald, thank you for taking the time to join us. Good luck with your efforts. and
Thank you very
let's
much.
see what we can do also with Hamla
And for all the
and
people
get
that are-
everything that's done.
I will.
Any questions? Obviously, finally, Maurice at JCPA, MAURICE@jcpa.org, or Gerald at NGO.
Not Gerald, just info at
NGO-Monitor.
NGO-Monitor.org. It'll get to me.
Thank you very much. Have a good day. Stay safe, everyone.